If you have ever stood on a dock or a marina walkway and felt the boards shift gently under your feet while you ate something out of a paper wrapper, you already understand the feeling McDonald's was chasing when it decided to build a restaurant that never had to touch dry land at all. Picture the hum of a hidden kitchen somewhere below deck, the soft mechanical clatter of a conveyor belt carrying a tray of food out to a front counter, the smell of frying oil mixing with salt water and diesel, and staff dressed in blue and white sailors' uniforms, moving between burgundy-toned dining rooms with potted plants and framed art on the walls. Outside the windows, instead of a parking lot, there was open water and the skyline of a city throwing the biggest party it had ever thrown. At its peak, this single restaurant could seat 1,400 people at once, across 2 decks of indoor dining rooms, garden rooms, and a wraparound outdoor deck. On its busiest days, it reportedly served as many as 12,000 customers, making it one of the busiest McDonald's locations anywhere on Earth, for as long as it lasted. It was built in steel, concrete, and a lightweight composite cladding called alucobond on a barge 187 feet long, and naval engineers later said its hull could realistically last more than 100 years. It survived a 6-month construction deadline tied to one of the largest world's fairs North America had hosted in a generation. It survived being orphaned the moment that fair closed its gates, sitting empty and unwanted for 5 straight years on the very water where it had once served thousands a day. It survived being forcibly evicted in 1991 by the new owners of the land around it. McDonald's complied. The McBarge, by then 5 years removed from serving a single customer, was towed out of False Creek to a new mooring spot in Burrard Inlet, near an oil refinery on the Burnaby shoreline, far from downtown Vancouver and far from any foot traffic at all. What almost nobody outside the company knew at the time was just how little appetite McDonald's corporate leadership had for chasing a second life for the structure. Relocating, refitting, and reopening a 187-foot floating restaurant required a level of capital investment and operational complexity that a standard drive-through location simply didn't. Rather than search for a new, permanent home, McDonald's effectively walked away from the asset, leaving it anchored and idle in Burrard Inlet, while the company turned its attention back to its core business of standardized, land-based restaurants across the country. The McBarge that had once been the most photographed restaurant of the entire fair was now, quite literally, parked behind an industrial site, where it would remain largely forgotten for the next decade. Its windows slowly clouding over, its once burgundy interior left to whatever weather found its way in through a hull nobody was actively maintaining. Expo 86 ran from May 2nd to October 13th, 1986, on the north shore of False Creek in Vancouver, and it would go on to draw more than 22 million visitors over those 6 months, roughly double the attendance of the previous World's Fair held in Knoxville, Tennessee, and triple that of the one before it in Louisiana. The fair, themed around transportation and communication, World in Motion, World in Touch, deliberately coincided with Vancouver's own 100th anniversary as an incorporated city, and was opened on May 2nd by the Prince and Princess of Wales alongside Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. McDonald's Canada built 5 separate restaurants across the Expo grounds to feed that crowd, at a combined construction cost reported at around $12 million. One of those 5 was meant to be the showpiece. McDonald's commissioned Robert Allen Limited, one of Canada's oldest naval architecture firms, to design a restaurant built directly onto a barge, 187 feet long, that could be moored on the water at False Creek, and, in theory, towed to a new permanent home once the fair ended. Reports on the actual construction cost of the barge itself vary. Some accounts put it as low as $8 million. Others, closer to the full $12 million figure, covering all 5 Expo locations combined. But every account agrees on what the company was buying with that money, something nobody had quite seen before. Inside, the design rejected almost every visual cue people associated with a McDonald's. Wooden floors, potted plants, framed artwork on the walls. A color palette of deep burgundy mixed with white and blue, meant to evoke a yacht rather than a drive-in. 2 full decks held a mix of enclosed dining rooms, glassed-in garden rooms, and an open wraparound deck with panoramic views across the water to the downtown skyline. The whole structure measured roughly 15,400 square feet, larger than most full-service restaurants built on solid ground. Most unusually for a McDonald's, the kitchen itself was hidden from customers entirely. Food didn't come from a visible grill behind a counter. It arrived via a conveyor belt that carried trays out to the front service area, an industrial detail dressed up to look almost like stage magic. Staff wore blue and white uniforms styled after ship's crews, not the red and yellow polyester of a typical 1980s McDonald's location. A small tugboat was even put to work skimming wrappers and cups out of the surrounding water, so the restaurant's own litter wouldn't drift visibly past its windows. Officially, the vessel was named Friendship 500. Almost nobody who worked there or visited it ever called it that. From the moment it opened, the public simply called it the McBarge. The first real crisis wasn't financial or political, it was physical. A barge of that size carrying a fully equipped restaurant kitchen, walk-in coolers, plumbing, and hundreds of diners at once had to be engineered to remain stable in open water without listing, while also being light enough and modular enough to be towed somewhere new after the fair. Naval architects solved this with a hull built from steel and concrete, a combination chosen for ballast and durability rather than speed, wrapped in lightweight Alucobond paneling above the waterline. The result was, by design, meant to be one of the most physically durable structures built for Expo '86. To understand why a hamburger company ever decided to build a restaurant that floated, you have to go back to a 52-year-old traveling salesman from Oak Park, Illinois, who sold milkshake mixing machines for a living. His name was Ray Kroc. By the early 1950s, he had spent decades moving from one sales job to the next. A paper cup salesman, a piano player, a radio announcer in his younger years, before eventually landing the exclusive distribution rights to a 5-spindle milkshake mixer called the Multi-Mixer. In 1954, a single hamburger stand in San Bernardino, California, run by 2 brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald, ordered 8 of his machines at once, enough to make 40 shakes at the same time. A restaurant ordering that many mixers was unusual enough that Kroc decided to fly out and see the place for himself. What he found was not a typical 1950s drive-in with car hops, trays hung on car windows, and a long wait for food. The McDonald brothers had stripped their menu down to almost nothing. Burgers, fries, shakes, soft drinks, and built what they called the Speedy Service System. An assembly line kitchen designed around paper packaging and pre-prepared ingredients, built to get food into a customer's hands in seconds rather than minutes. Kroc, a man with no formal culinary training and no engineering background, saw something the brothers themselves had never fully exploited, that this system could be copied exactly in city after city by people who had never met him and never needed to. By the late 1970s, the very thing that had made McDonald's a phenomenon had started to make it look dated. A new generation of consumers, raised on the McDonald's of their own childhoods, had begun drifting toward bistros, wine bars, and anything that felt a step above plastic trays and orange seating. The first experiment in answering that problem wasn't in Vancouver at all. It was on the Mississippi River in St. Louis, Missouri. On March 11, 1980, after the city's Board of Aldermen had already rejected McDonald's original request to open a franchise directly inside the visitor center beneath the Gateway Arch, a local franchisee named Dr. Benjamin H. Davis Sr. opened a restaurant built into a stationary, paddle-wheeler-styled barge moored on the riverfront instead. It seated roughly 130 people inside, and another 200 across its open decks under a 25-year lease signed the year before. People who grew up in St. Louis in the 1980s would later remember it less for its food than for the smell, a mix of diesel, fryer grease, and the muddy Mississippi itself, and for the simple thrill in a landlocked state of eating a Big Mac somewhere that felt a little like a yacht. The riverboat worked. It generated roughly $100,000 a year in city tax revenue and ran for 2 decades, becoming almost by accident the world's first floating McDonald's. It finally closed on November 6, 2000, after the company said its aging structure needed renovations too costly to justify. The renovation never happened, and the boat itself simply disappeared from the historical record afterward, its eventual fate never publicly confirmed. What Kroc had built, and what his successors were now managing, was not simply a restaurant chain, it was a system for removing uncertainty from the act of eating. The power of McDonald's was never primarily about the food. It was about predictability. A customer who had eaten at one McDonald's already knew exactly what they would find at any other one, whether they were in Oak Brook, Illinois, or Osaka, Japan. The architecture was the same. The packaging was the same. The cleaning schedule was posted on the same laminated card inside the same stainless steel frame in every restaurant's kitchen. That predictability was, by the early 1980s, beginning to be perceived by some parts of the company's customer base as a limitation rather than a feature. The chain had already responded with outdoor playland play areas, and with the deliberate decision to place restaurants inside airports, hospitals, and highway rest stops, anywhere that foot traffic already existed in large numbers. The floating restaurant in St. Louis, and later the far grander experiment in Vancouver, were part of the same exploratory logic. If you placed a McDonald's somewhere unexpected enough, the experience of eating there became a destination rather than a habit, and the brand became associated with novelty rather than mere convenience. Whether that logic could sustain a permanent business in a post-fair world was a question the company never fully answered in Vancouver or anywhere else. By the mid-1980s, though, McDonald's Canada had a far bigger stage to chase that same novelty on. Vancouver, British Columbia, had won the right to host the 1986 World Exposition on Transportation and Communication, Expo 86Cs, and the company wanted a presence there that would do more than feed a crowd. This time, it wasn't going to settle for a stationary riverboat tied up on a single stretch of shoreline. It wanted something built to move. If you want to know exactly how strange that ambition got, stick around, because the boat the company built to chase it would end up stranger and far more durable than anyone at the company likely expected. For 6 months, the McBarge was, by almost every account from the people who actually worked there, one of the busiest restaurants of any kind on the continent. Todd Maffin was 16 years old that summer, working as part of the Expo service crew. Decades later, by then a broadcaster and public speaker, he would describe the McBarge as one of the 3 busiest restaurants on the entire fairground, alongside the Unicorn Pub and the Saskatchewan Pavilion restaurant, which had its own surprise hit on the menu in the form of an enormous lemon meringue pie. The pace at the McBarge, Maffin recalled, was so relentless that serving customers turned into something close to a kind of performance art, staff working a hidden kitchen and a conveyor belt at a speed built less for an ordinary fast food counter and more for genuine crowd control. Expo 86, he later said without hesitation, was one of the best summers of his life. That pace reflected the scale of the fair itself. Expo 86 had drawn pavilions from 54 nations, alongside major corporate exhibits from companies including General Motors, Canadian Pacific, and BCTV, which ran a fully functional broadcast studio on site. The fair ran for 165 consecutive days without closing, feeding and entertaining an average of well over 130,000 visitors a day. It was not without its tensions. A planned outdoor concert at the BCTV pavilion famously dissolved into a near riot among young fairgoers. Loud enough that organizers cut the station's live nightly newscast mid-broadcast and replaced it, almost as an act of surrender, with that evening's scheduled movie. The McBarge's location made it almost impossible to miss. Moored directly on the Expo grounds in False Creek, it sat in clear view of the SkyTrain line that had opened just months earlier to ferry fairgoers around the site, and of the geodesic dome that would later become the city's Science World Museum. For many visitors, especially children, eating a Big Mac on a boat, rather than in a parking lot, was as memorable a part of the day as any of the pavilions themselves. What those lineups looked like from the water was almost as memorable as the food itself. Photographs taken by Expo visitors in the summer of 1986 show queues snaking along the floating dock that connected the McBarge to the fairgrounds, sometimes stretching back toward the main fairway, with the white and burgundy hulk of the restaurant floating behind them in False Creek and the North Shore Mountains visible above the roofline beyond. Inside, the dining rooms, designed to look nothing like a standard McDonald's, gave visitors the experience of eating in something closer to a docked cruise ship than a fast food outlet, with views of the water and the Expo grounds visible through picture windows that framed the fair's entire spectacle from a vantage point nobody standing on land could match. The wraparound outdoor deck for anyone willing to carry their tray outside between the Vancouver summer showers offered an uninterrupted sightline across False Creek to the Expo Center's geodesic dome, and beyond it to the downtown skyline of a city that, for 6 months, had successfully convinced the world it was somewhere worth visiting. For visitors who had traveled from out of province or from outside Canada entirely, the experience the McBarge offered was effectively a 2-for-1, a meal that was familiar, reliable, and fast, delivered in a setting that was none of those things. The food was the same food available at any McDonald's across the street from their house back home. What made the difference was the building, or rather, the fact that the building was afloat. The restaurant also became, almost accidentally, a training ground. Like much of Expo 86's seasonal workforce, many of the staff serving food on the McBarge were teenagers and young adults working their first real jobs, learning to handle a dining room at a volume few restaurants anywhere would ever see again. What almost nobody watching the lineups at the time knew was that some of those same young staff would go on to careers in broadcasting, business, and public life, carrying decades later a genuine fondness for an assembly line hamburger boat as one of the formative jobs of their lives. By the time the fair's closing ceremonies were held on October 13, 1986, the McBarge had served, by some estimates, well over 1 million meals. To put that number in context, over those 165 consecutive days, the restaurant had fed, on its busiest shifts, the equivalent of a small city's population in a single afternoon, more customers than many full-service restaurants see in several years of normal operation. The staff who worked through that summer described the experience in almost the same terms: a total sensory immersion, the kitchen noise coming up through the floor, the salt and diesel of the harbour mixing with the fryer oil, the view out the windows changing each time a harbour vessel passed close enough to make the whole building sway a few inches. The last shift ended on a Sunday evening. When Expo 86's closing ceremonies concluded on October 13th and the fair's lights went out across False Creek, the McBarge's kitchen went dark with them. Its serving counters cleared and its dining rooms emptied of that day's last customers. There was no farewell event specific to the vessel, no commemorative last meal, no announcement that the restaurant would not reopen the following morning. In the context of a World's Fair that had run for 165 days, the McBarge simply stopped on a Sunday evening in October, the way a machine stops when someone finally turns the power off. It would never serve another one again. The entire premise of the McBarge's design, the reason it sat on a barge instead of a foundation, was that it could be towed somewhere new once Expo 86 ended and quietly become a normal, permanent restaurant. That unfortunately never happened at all. Those 5 years between 1986 and 1991 were, by external appearances, unremarkable. The McBarge remained moored inside the former Expo site, which had been partially converted to interim uses, temporary markets, occasional events, and the early stages of redevelopment planning. While the city and province worked through the question of what a post-Expo False Creek waterfront would eventually become. Visitors arriving to photograph the former fairgrounds in the late 1980s could still see the McBarge from the waterfront, its bulk still recognizable despite dark windows and an absence of any crew or activity. A full-scale restaurant sitting in a cove with no apparent purpose. Local journalists occasionally noted its continued presence as a curiosity. McDonald's made no public statements about its intentions for the structure. The reason it eventually moved at all had nothing to do with McDonald's own plans for it. In 1988, 2 years after the fair closed, the British Columbia government sold roughly 80 hectares of the former Expo lands, including the rail yards and waterfront where the fair had stood, to the Concord Pacific Development Corporation, controlled by Hong Kong businessman Li Ka-shing, in a deal worth $320 million spread over 15 years. The sale began, by some accounts, with a private dinner between Li and then Premier Bill van der Zalm during Expo 86 itself, and it was negotiated through months of internal conflict inside the provincial government. A rival, largely homegrown proposal, backed by local financiers, including the late Peter Toigo and the late Jack Poole, and reportedly involving early talks with the Disney Corporation about a permanent amusement park on part of the site, lost out to Li's bid. The deal, ultimately unveiled by Economic Development Minister Grace McCarthy in April 1988, was immediately and lastingly controversial, with critics arguing the land had been sold for a fraction of its eventual value. University of Wisconsin geography professor Christopher Olds would later write a chapter on the deal in his book on global megaprojects, describing Li as a businessman with an acute sense of timing. Concord Pacific had no interest in keeping a derelict floating restaurant moored on land. It now intended to redevelop into the dense waterfront neighborhood that would eventually become known, fittingly, as Concord Pacific Place. And then, 39 years after the day it first opened its doors, on a quiet morning in March 2025, with almost nobody watching, it simply rolled onto its side in a river in British Columbia and began to sink. How does a $12 million flagship restaurant, engineered to outlast a century of salt water, end up capsized in a provincial river with government agencies unable to even confirm who legally owned it? And what actually happened, decade after decade, inside that gutted, rusting hull while an entire generation waited for it to come back? What was quietly happening in those same years was that the city itself was changing around the barge in ways that would eventually make its eviction a near inevitability. Vancouver in the late 1980s was experiencing the early stages of the transformation that Expo 86 had helped accelerate. New residents arriving from Hong Kong in significant numbers, property values rising faster than they had at any point in recent history, and a new generation of city planners beginning to imagine the False Creek waterfront not as a post-industrial brownfield, but as what it would eventually become, one of the most extensively landscaped and densely developed urban waterfronts in North America. Into that transformation, the McBarge fit less and less comfortably. It was costing someone in maintenance costs every month, earning nothing, and tying up a water lot on land that the provincial government was already preparing to sell. The moment the deal with Concord Pacific was signed in 1988, the McBarge's continued presence on the former Expo site became, in practical terms, a countdown clock. When the fair closed on October 13, 1986, the McBarge simply stayed where it was, moored on the former Expo grounds at False Creek, its kitchen dark and its dining rooms empty. McDonald's Canada had, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely intended to keep operating it as a restaurant somewhere, but no new site, no new partner, and no clear plan ever materialized in the months that followed. The barge that had served up to 12,000 people a day simply sat tied to a dock, unused, for 5 straight years, while the city around it began to change. It's tempting, in a story like this one, to look for a single decision-maker who killed the McBarge. One name, one signature, one bad call. The honest answer is messier than that, and arguably more damning, because it spreads the responsibility across at least 3 parties, none of whom were ever forced to fully answer for it. The first is McDonald's Corporation itself. The company built an extraordinary, expensive, technically ambitious piece of marine architecture for a 6-month event, then made no serious provision for what would happen to it afterward. Its own design brief, a restaurant that could be towed to a new permanent home, assumed a level of post-Expo planning that corporate leadership simply never followed through on. When the bill for relocating and refitting the barge came due in the early 1990s, the company chose to surrender the asset rather than invest in it, even though it had cost roughly $33 million in today's money to build in the first place, and even though its own naval architects had designed a hull meant to last 100 years. The second is the British Columbia government of the day, which sold the entire former Expo site, including the water lot the McBarge depended on, to a single foreign buyer for $320 million, a deal even insiders working inside the Premier's office at the time would later describe as deeply controversial within the governing party itself. That sale set in motion the redevelopment pressure that 3 years later would force the barge out of the one location where it had ever actually functioned as intended. The third is Concord Pacific, which inherited a piece of land with a deteriorating, money-losing floating structure attached to it, and exercised its right as the new owner to have it removed rather than find any way to incorporate it into the neighborhood being built around it. Concord's own redevelopment, led in its early years by Lee's son, Victor Lee, would go on to be credited decades later with setting a new standard for Canadian urban planning, public parks, seawalls, and community amenities folded into Vancouver's now famous waterfront towers. None of that planning, in the end, made room for the restaurant that had once defined the very water those towers now overlook. Once it was anchored in Burrard Inlet, the McBarge entered the period that would come to define its public image more than its 6 months of actual operation ever did: the long, slow decay. Stripped of its furnishings and most of its copper wiring and fittings not long after the move, the barge sat largely unguarded, becoming a target for vandals, souvenir hunters, and graffiti artists drawn by its sheer strangeness. A hulking, 2-story glass and metal restaurant with nobody inside, bobbing beside an industrial refinery. For most of the 1990s, it was, in the words used by multiple later news accounts, simply forgotten. For most of a decade, the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, the McBarge existed in a peculiar cultural limbo that had almost nothing to do with any restaurant or business. Moored beside an oil refinery, stripped of its furniture, its wiring, and most of its movable fittings, it had become a kind of urban ruin, visible from the Barnett Highway but inaccessible to the general public, obviously recognizable as a 2-story floating building but with no signage to tell anyone who hadn't already known what it was. It re-entered public consciousness almost by accident in 2003, when location scouts for the Marvel Entertainment and New Line Cinema production Blade Trinity rented the derelict barge as a filming location, using its decaying post-industrial interior as the lair of the film's vampire hunting characters, the Night Stalkers. The film, released in 2004, gave the structure its first new wave of public attention in over a decade, though as a backdrop for horror, not as a restaurant. Ownership of the barge, by this point, had passed to a Gastown property developer named Howard Meakin. Different contemporary accounts place the date of his acquisition differently. Some local reporting from the mid-2010s describes him as having already owned it for well over a decade by that point, while other retrospective accounts date the purchase alongside his wife Kathy to 2010. What's consistent across every account is that by 2009, fan enthusiasm for the barge was already building. A Facebook group called Save the McBarge, founded that year, would go on to attract several thousand members over the following decade, sharing old photographs, news clippings, and updates on the derelict vessel's condition to bar. And that by June of that same year, Meakin was actively pursuing a plan to give the McBarge a second life. That June, he submitted a proposal to the City Council in Mission, British Columbia, for a waterfront development on the Fraser River called Sturgeons on the Fraser, with a refurbished McBarge as its centerpiece. The roughly $10 million plan envisioned several restaurants, a marina complex, paddle-wheeler excursions, and float plane service connecting to Victoria and Nanaimo. As of August 2010, the proposal still had local support but remained stuck awaiting council approval. It was ultimately rejected over concerns about float plane noise and other environmental issues, and Mission's municipal government went on to purchase the riverfront property Meakin had needed for the project, closing off that path entirely. In December 2015, Meakin announced the barge would finally leave Burrard Inlet after nearly 30 years at anchor. It was towed to Maple Ridge, British Columbia, on December 22nd, mooring at a working shipyard called Supreme Structural Transport on River Road, where Meakin struck a deal with the property's owner for space to begin a planned $4.5 million refit. Marine surveys at the time reportedly found the hull in near pristine condition and the superstructure structurally sound. "It will be restored and refitted," Meakin told reporters, declining to say exactly where it would eventually end up, only that there were, in his words, a number of communities excited about seeing it brought back. By 2017, the plan had a name and a partner. Meakin teamed up with Phil Knighton, a North Vancouver inventor of submersible diving suits and submarines who had recently received the Order of Canada, to convert the gutted barge into something called the Deep Ocean Discovery Centre, a planned 15,400 square foot museum dedicated to Pacific Ocean exploration and conservation, built around Knighton's own collection of vintage diving equipment, accumulated over decades and stored by his own account in roughly 35 shipping containers. "We want people to love the ocean," Knighton told CBC News. "Before you can love something, you have to know about it." The plan called for interactive exhibits, live camera feeds from underwater locations around Metro Vancouver, a planned shark cage display, submersible rides hundreds of meters beneath the surface if a crowdfunding campaign succeeded, and a deliberate focus on coastal First Nations underwater technology, including replicas Knighton had built of the dentalium harvesting tools once used by the Nuu-chah-nulth people of Vancouver Island, long before any Europeans set foot on the coast. Knighton, who is Métis but was adopted into the Kwakiutl First Nation, spoke of an even larger long-term ambition, an underwater colony beneath Burrard Inlet itself. Architect David Eaton and designer Nigel Walker worked with the team for more than a year. By the time the project was publicly announced, Meakin pointed to 2.2 million views of old McBarge footage on YouTube as proof the public appetite for the structure had never really gone away. A public Bring Back McBarge kickoff event was scheduled for October 21, 2017, at the Maple Ridge Shipyard, meant to launch fundraising and a push to have the city of Vancouver designate the barge a historic floating vessel. The event never happened. Vancouver's weather that day brought roughly 50 millimeters of rain and the coldest temperatures of the season, and organizers were forced to cancel, citing safety concerns around tents, an outdoor jet boat safari demonstration, and the protection of display materials. A petition seeking historic status for the barge, launched around the same time, gathered only 185 signatures. The Deep Ocean Discovery Center's social media accounts went quiet after 2017 and were never meaningfully updated again. By 2020, the plan had shifted once more. Reports surfaced that Meakin was pursuing a seafood restaurant concept for the barge, though no site had been secured. In 2021, an undisclosed location was reportedly chosen, pending government approval that never came through publicly. That same year, a small documentary crew from Bright Sun Films was given a rare tour aboard the gutted vessel, where Meakin, by then describing himself as having owned the barge for 3 decades, admitted he had never expected the project to take this long. His business associate, Larry McGuinness, noted that the structure had been over-engineered for what it was originally asked to do, a McDonald's restaurant, which was, perversely, the very reason it had survived this long at all. Through every one of these proposals, Mission's waterfront marina, the Deep Sea Museum, the seafood restaurant, the same pattern repeated. A plan would be announced with genuine enthusiasm, attract local media coverage, and then quietly stall against some combination of zoning rules, municipal politics, weather, or funding that never arrived. By the early 2020s, the McBarge had been moored at the Supreme Structural Transport Yard in Maple Ridge for the better part of a decade, with no active restoration underway and no announced plan moving forward in any visible way. Then, on March 26, 2025, a passerby documented something different on social media. The barge had tipped onto its side and was partially capsized in the Fraser River. Word spread quickly online, but the official response moved far more slowly. City of Maple Ridge bylaw staff, led by Director Michelle Adams, visited the site to assess the vessel's condition, but confirmed that jurisdiction over a partially sunken barge fell to the federal government through Transport Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard. The Coast Guard determined the McBarge posed no significant navigational hazard, since it was grounded and secured against pilings rather than drifting freely, and no fuel or pollutants were detected on board, which, under the framework of Canada's Wrecked, Abandoned or Hazardous Vessels Act, meant its removal was treated as a low priority rather than an emergency. There was a more basic problem still unresolved days after the sinking. Nobody could find the owner. Transport Canada confirmed it was actively trying to contact the registered owner of the vessel, by then officially renamed the Seabourn II, but had been unsuccessful even a full week after the capsizing. Maple Ridge Mayor Dan Remy, speaking publicly within 72 hours of the event, was already warning that the cleanup could take years. Why is it so difficult to remove abandoned or derelict vessels? He asked reporters, noting that even when an owner could be identified, governments still struggled to compel them to pay for removal or to find the funding to do it themselves. Behind the scenes, 3 separate levels of government, provincial, federal, and municipal, were already in conversation about who, if anyone, was actually responsible for what happened next. The contrast between the online response and the official response to the capsizing was stark. On social media, the photographs of the McBarge on its side generated thousands of comments within hours, a combination of genuine nostalgia from Expo 86 veterans now in their 50s and 60s, dry humor from a younger generation that had grown up reading articles about the barge's perpetual near revival, and real frustration from residents of Maple Ridge who had watched the vessel deteriorate at the Supreme Structural Transport Yard for the better part of a decade. Several photographs showing the upper deck almost touching the waterline were shared widely, often alongside archival photographs taken from the same angle in 1986, when the same vessel had carried a full dining room and a queue extending across a floating dock at one of the largest World's Fairs North America had ever hosted. The comparison, when the two images appeared side by side, was difficult to look away from. Inside the regulatory structures responsible for doing something about it, the situation was nearly as complicated as Mayor Ruimi's public comments suggested. Estimated cleanup costs for a partially submerged steel and concrete barge of its size ran into the millions of dollars, a figure none of the three levels of government appeared prepared to commit to. The reason nobody could reach Howard Meakin had nothing to do with bureaucracy. On April 30th, 2025, just over a month after the barge he had spent more than 2 decades trying to save finally went under, Meakin died peacefully at Lionsgate Hospital in North Vancouver at the age of 80, surrounded by his family. Friends remembered his Christian faith, his restless energy, his love of cross-country skiing and powerboating, and a small weekly ritual that, in hindsight, reads almost like an epitaph for the entire project he poured so much of his later life into. Every Friday, Meakin shared a McDonald's ice cream cone with his dog, Noah, who rode along with him to the office most days. What almost nobody following the McBarge news that spring connected at the time was that the man trying for more than 2 decades to revive the strangest McDonald's restaurant ever built had, all along, simply liked McDonald's. So how does the most photographed restaurant of an entire World's Fair end up capsized in a river with no clear owner? And what really happened inside those walls across nearly 4 decades of waiting? The mechanism, in the end, wasn't a single catastrophic failure. It was a chain of smaller ones, each individually reasonable, none of them ever quite resolved. A corporation that built something brilliant for 6 months and made no real plan beyond it. A government land sale that displaced the one site where the building had ever worked. A developer who genuinely believed, for more than 2 decades, that he could bring it back and kept almost succeeding without ever quite getting there. And a regulatory system, in the end, too slow and too underfunded to step in until the structure had already gone under. What was really happening inside the McBarge for most of those 39 years was, simply, nothing. An empty, gutted hull, slowly losing a fight against rust and water that nobody with the authority to stop it ever fully committed to winning. As of late 2025, the McBarge remained exactly where it sank, moored, on its side, partially submerged, behind the Supreme Structural Transport Shipyard at 23,660 River Road in the Albion area of Maple Ridge, British Columbia. By November of that year, it had become an active obstacle rather than just a curiosity. A local builder named John Anjo, founder of a prefabricated housing company called Dwelltech Industries, had hoped to use that same waterfront space to build a floating factory for shipping modular homes to remote coastal communities along the BC coast, only to find the derelict barge physically blocking the spot he needed. Of the 5 McDonald's restaurants built for Expo '86, the McBarge's fate stands in sharp contrast to at least one of its siblings. Shipped piece by piece across the Sunshine Coast and reassembled over roughly 2 years, it reopened in 1988 as the Lighthouse Pub and remains open today, a genuine second life for a piece of the same fare built by the same company in the same year that the McBarge itself was never able to find. The gap between those two fates, the Lighthouse Pub open every night in Sechelt, the McBarge capsized in a river with no confirmed owner, points to a distinction that matters more than any of the individual decisions made across the McBarge's nearly 4-decade decline. The McBarge also ran headlong again and again into what might be called the paradox of the over-engineered artifact. Because it was built to last, nobody who owned it ever felt urgency to act. That condition of perpetual, almost viability was, in a quiet and frustrating way, the very thing that killed it. But everything that made the final tip possible had been happening in slow motion for a very long time. What survives of the McBarge today exists almost entirely in memory and in the enthusiasm of strangers. And in a city that demolished the Plaza of Nations in 2007, the simple fact that the McBarge's hull, however battered, is still recognizably itself concrete and steel, built to outlast a century, counts in its own quiet way as a kind of survival. Responsibility for what happened to it never rested with one villain. McDonald's built something it never fully committed to. A government sold land out from under it. A developer loved it more than he was ever able to save it. And in the end, the agencies meant to prevent exactly this kind of slow-motion loss arrived only after the water had already won. If you rode the SkyTrain to Expo 86 as a kid, if you ate a Big Mac on that boat and never forgot it, if your parents worked the lineups on that barge the same summer Todd Maffin did, you already know what almost sank with it. If you worked there, or if your family did, or if you remember standing on that deck in 1986, tell us in the comments. What country are you watching from? What part of this story hit you hardest? And did you, or anyone you know, ever set foot on the McBarge?